dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So to address the elephant in the room, yes, I did not end up making an episode last week, which, in my defense, I did warn that might be a possibility. Now, I did think about making one, but it just kind of didn't happen. Basically due to how I prioritized unpacking of my stuff, which we'll get into more on that later in the episode, I barely got enough unpacked to, have enough stuff to cook for myself, shower, and go to bed, let alone try to record a podcast episode. Now that things are mostly unpacked, I'm pretty confident that we'll be back to our regularly scheduled programming for the foreseeable future. Now, while it's not relevant to you because this podcast comes out on Saturday, this is quite the late night for me, which is, in fairness, partly self-inflicted since I decided not to unpack my audio gear until this moment right before recording the podcast, which, yes, I know, gotta love procrastination right there. But I was also at the store before I came home to record this podcast, and my goodness, I don't know about you guys, but whenever I go to a store that I've never been to before, I basically have no idea where anything is and essentially just end up wandering aimlessly around the store like I'm completely lost because I kind of sort of am because I don't know where anything is. Now, yes, I know there's signs around the store to kind of help guide you along through, where things are supposed to be. But even with that, sometimes it still can be hard to find stuff because it's like there are a couple of different aisles that like an item you're looking for could potentially be in, and you're like, I don't know, is it in that one or is it that one? And then you inevitably walk through every single aisle, realize you didn't find it, and then you have to backtrace all through the other aisles. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but anyway, I spent way too much time there trying to find where the groceries I wanted were. And I guess to address the other elephant in the room, because this is just unpacking the audio gear, the audio quality may or may not be what it usually is. I'm not sure. I haven't listened to the recording yet. So I guess if it does sound a little off, I'm still trying to kind of get things settled. And hopefully next week I will have a more finalized setup. I guess we'll see about that. But anyway, all of that out of the way, let's get into this week's episode with our trivia question. So this week's trivia question is, if you enter the domain relentless.com, that will redirect you to where? So if you enter relentless.com, where does that redirect you? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, I know this isn't a sports podcast, but hear me out for a quick second. Did anyone else notice Kevin Burkhardt at the Super Bowl this past weekend? Because I don't know if it was just me, but he was giving off some serious Air Force One, aka Craig Federighi vibes, with that hairstyle he had going on. And I don't know if anyone else kind of saw that, or maybe it was just me. But I don't know. I just felt like I would share that in case anyone missed it. But with that, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. Now, this week's cybersecurity tip somewhat builds upon last week's cybersecurity tip, which is do not wear your ID badges outside of your workplace. Now, before last episode, I gotta clarify there. Last episode, the cybersecurity tip was to not post your ID badges online because it allows threat actors the ability to have a good, proof of, reference material essentially to make copies of your various work badges, which is why you don't want to do it. But the other thing you don't want to do is you don't want to go around wearing your work badge outside of work. Now, of course, if you are at work, of course, you need to be wearing your badge so people know that you're actually supposed to be there. But if you're outside of work, you essentially paint a target on yourself for would-be threat actors and social engineers to try to get information about the organization that you work for. Now, usually, I think people, when they think about this, they think of government organizations, but this isn't strictly related to governments only, because obviously, if a threat actor or a social engineer sees a government official, they're going to want to try to get as much information as they can about them, especially if they're from a different country, potentially an adversary. But on the flip side, if you work for, say, like a tech company or a financial, company or something like that, and you have a product or a service or a solution or something like that, that is kind of a market leader in the industry, others within your industry will want to steal that information in order to gain an edge to make their product better and maybe kind of get a competitive edge on your company. So essentially, by wearing your badge in public, you're essentially broadcasting to the world, hey, look at me, I work for company XYZ. Did not intend for that to rhyme, but it did, so I'm pretty proud of that. Now, in fairness, some companies make pretty generic looking badges for their company badges. But again, you have to remember, if you're a threat actor doing research on a company to try to steal information about them, you're almost definitely, at least if you're any good at your job, you're almost definitely going to research what the company you're trying to steal from, what their corporate badges look like, so you can be kind of on a lookout for if you see any of those out in the wild. So just because a corporate badge might look very innocuous and very bland and, inconspicuous, someone that's trained to identify one of those badges will be able to pick it up even though it doesn't necessarily look like anything special. So yeah, I mean, it's like if you, it's like one of those things where once you see something, you can't unsee something. So if you just look past someone at someone's badge and it looks inconspicuous, you don't think anything of it, but then you go do some research and you realize, oh, that's company WYF's badge or whatever, and then you see that badge again, it sticks out like a sore thumb, that kind of a thing. So it's the same thing with threat actors. So yeah, don't wear your corporate ID badges outside of the office. And that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. So moving right along, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So you guys know the saying, it's quiet, too quiet? So before I moved, that was my house when all of my servers were off. It was way too quiet and it felt like something was wrong. Probably because something was wrong, my home lab wasn't running. And personally, I'm not used to just peace and quiet around. I'm used to the faint background noise of server fans. So it just kind of felt like something was wrong, even though technically nothing was, but also technically it was, because like I said, my home lab wasn't running. So something was definitely wrong. But for the normal person that doesn't have, enterprise gear, roaring away with their server fans, that's just their, their normal everyday life. And for me, it's like, it's too quiet in here. There needs to be some noise going on. Where are the fans? But on the topic of moving, though, I gotta give a quick shout out to the movers, because one of the things that I was very interested in how they were going to move was my server rack. Because my server rack, unfortunately, well, among other things, does not have any sort of casters or wheels that you can easily move it around. And one thing it does have, though, like I think most kind of server racks, it's held together with nuts and bolts and things like that. So I was totally expecting for them to essentially take the whole thing apart into pieces. But no, I was very much wrong. Now, granted, I did remove like 95% of the things from the server rack. The only things that were still in there when the movers came was a network switch and then 2 rack shelves, and then like 2 power distribution rack mount units. And I was fully expecting for them to take all those things off and disassemble the server rack, but they didn't. What they did was they basically wrapped it in one of those moving mats and then put this, like, whatever the saran wrap thing that movers and shippers put on like furniture and stuff, kind of wrap that around it. And then this guy just full on like picks it up, like puts it on his back and starts carrying the thing out of the room, down the stairs, and out the front door. And I was like, what what? Like I said, I was fully expecting them to take this thing apart, but they just decided to take the whole thing as is. So apparently my baby little 15U rack was essentially chump change for them. And then when they actually brought it to my new place, it was rather interesting how they did it, since it was a different moving team bringing stuff in. And essentially what they did was they kind of, if I'm remembering correctly, I think they kind of end over ended it up the stairs, and then just kind of slide it back into the new server room. I believe that's what happened. Now, thankfully, everything was fine that was still in the rack. Nothing like broke or anything like that, which I wasn't necessarily too concerned about, because everything was pretty well held in there, so I wasn't necessarily too concerned about it. But if something did break, the components that were in there weren't like the most expensive. Probably the most annoying thing to replace would be the network switch, but that's an old like Brocade switch, and they're pretty cheap to find on eBay, so it wouldn't have been that hard to get a replacement for it. And then the PDUs, the power distribution units, if one of those broke for whatever reason, I mean, those are like a dime a dozen on Amazon, so wouldn't have been that bad to replace it either. And then the same thing goes for the rack shelves. But when it came to the post move, I mentioned my unpacking strategy. I think most people, when they start unpacking their house, they think about the essentials, right? They start with the kitchen, maybe the bathrooms, and some of the other living spaces to make their place livable. But I bet you can't guess what I started with. And if you didn't guess my servers and other home lab equipment to get that back up and running, I honestly don't know what to tell you, aside from the fact that you need to listen to more episodes of the Dark Assassins podcast, because I think for anyone that's listened to enough episodes, it should have been very blatantly obvious that that was the first thing that I would go to. So naturally, once everything got moved in, my first goal was to get the home lab up and running. So the first thing I had to do was get the router modem Wi-Fi combo thing that I got. And since I made the correct solution this time of buying my own modem rather than getting one from the ISP, when I plugged it in, it didn't work because the ISP didn't recognize this modem, so I had to call them and get all that sorted. But then, of course, because I'm at a new location with a new ISP, I had a new IP address. But sure enough, my handy dandy little script that notifies me when my IP address updates, as soon as my home lab got turned on, that script ran, got a nice notification that my IP address had been updated, and then my handy dandy script in the cloud was able to start checking again to see if my home lab was up and running, and everything was working beautifully. But I think the other thing we should address was the over engineering, I guess, and security measures that I took to make sure that my NAS would survive the move. And if you remember the past few episodes, I kind of went through deep diving this, but essentially what the solution was I had 4 SSDs from an old hypervisor that I ended up getting rid of, and I used those 4 SSDs to essentially clone my NAS onto them, and then I basically hand carried those SSDs with me throughout the move, so they were always with me. So in the event that 3 of the hard drives in my NAS died, as well as 1 of the hard drives in my Xserve, I would still have a complete backup copy of my NAS and all of my data and all of my backups, and everything would be fine. Now, thankfully, once I booted everything back up, the first thing I did, I think even before I checked my hypervisors, was I checked my NAS to see what the status of the drives were, to see if there was any damage. And thankfully, all of the drives survived and there were no dead ones. I don't know if there was any potential wear on the drives through the move, but none of the drives died, so we are all good there. So I guess in the end, I was definitely a little over paranoid and took, you know, more precautions than I needed. But, as they always say, better to have and not need than need and not have. So the only, I guess, real issue that I ran into with my home lab was my Bitwarden instance, since when I tried to access it, I was unable to. So, a little bit of troubleshooting later, like logging into the server to reboot it, checking the Docker status, the IP addresses, all that good stuff. I realized I needed to get myself one of Jeff Geerling's t-shirts that says it was DNS, because it was in fact DNS. So, but yeah, once Bitwarden essentially was fine and up and running and everything was good. But my Mac that I was using at the time to try to connect to it, for whatever reason, its DNS was messed up. So I had to kind of work around that. But after that, I was able to access it, get it working. And yeah, but well, I guess even after I kind of cleared the DNS on my Mac, I did end up having to reboot it, turn it off and turn it back on again. So basically, within the span of 30 minutes, I encountered like all of the most common, like stereotypical issues and tropes and solutions in IT. That being DNS being an issue and turning something on and back off, turning something on and off again, or off and back on again, I guess. But also, can we just appreciate how glorious the internet speed at my new place is? Now, I'm not going to, go into all the details of it, but needless to say, my internet speed is over double what it was at my previous place, and I'm paying like half the price for it. So, definitely a pretty big win there. And yeah, granted, the upload speed is not setting the world on fire by any stretch of the imagination, but that's cable for you. Unfortunately, while there is fiber in my area, the place I am currently in does not have fiber run to it, which is very unfortunate. And yes, I did check, because that was, of course, one of the first things that I was kind of looking at when looking at places to move. And the place that I found, one of the first things I checked in trying to set up services and stuff was the internet. And unfortunately, the fiber solution was not available at my place, which was definitely a big sad, but it is what it is. But for what it's worth, I'm not complaining. My internet speed is way faster, and I'm also paying less for it. So honestly, I can't really complain. But all that kind of moving stuff out of the way, I think that kind of brings us into the main topic of the episode, which is kind of this idea of buying something versus building it from scratch. The internal debate in software engineering: should you build your own solution or should you use an off-the-shelf product? Now, I think we probably touched on this in a previous episode, like a while back, but it was something I kind of wanted to revisit because I mentioned, it's kind of a age-old debate. It's been going on since the beginning of software, and it will probably continue on till the end of time. But why does this even matter in the first place? Now, it's not just, businesses and like corporate environments. It also applies to homelabbers too, because I think like you and me, I constantly, at least I find myself in this decision where I try to decide if when building out my infrastructure or workflows or tooling or things like that, working on personal projects, of do I build something from scratch or do I use like an open source project on GitHub, for instance. Now, speaking of home labs though, This also applies for when you're deciding on what hardware decisions you want to do, like what you want to go with, because you could totally build your own custom system. You buy, all the components, you buy the CPU, the motherboard, the RAM, graphics cards, chassis, all that good stuff, and assemble it yourself. Or you could buy, an off-the-shelf pre-built system, whether that's, a new system you buy from a manufacturer, or it's something you bought used off eBay. But for the sake of this episode, I'm going to focus mainly on the software side of things. So I think when I was talking about like working on my video game, this was a pretty good example of this kind of idea, because I wanted to do everything from scratch. And when I originally set out to make the video game, I was fully prepared to even go as far as writing my own graphics library from scratch. And then I did some research and realized that writing my own graphics library would essentially be as big of, if not even bigger, of a project than making my own video game. So I was like, yeah, I'll just use an off-the-shelf one. Thank you very much. So it's these kinds of things that you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons of should you go and roll your own, or should you, just use an off-the-shelf one. So in this episode, we're going to kind of break down some of those factors that kind of play a role into that, some real-world examples, pros and cons, and some decision-making strategies that you can use to help decide if you should build it yourself or if you should just use an off-the-shelf one. Now, the first thing that I guess we should talk about is the appeal and kind of the pros of making your own solution. Now, the most obvious benefit to making your own custom solution is you can tailor the software to fit your exact needs and your workflow to a T. The only problem with, I guess one of the most common problems with modern software is the bloat that comes with it. And I don't necessarily mean like there's a bunch of garbage that's bundled in with it, although if we're being honest with ourselves, if you just look at any quote-unquote fresh install of Windows, there's a lot of bloat on one of those systems. But what I mean is there's a lot of software out there that when you use it, you only use like a handful of the features that it has. Like, there's so many features in like modern software these days where I would bet that most of you probably don't even know or use all the features it has. Like, I would bet that you probably don't know every teensy weensy little detail that the software has, like, all of the keyboard shortcuts that you can do, or all of maybe the hidden menus that are in there, things like that. All those features and functions that you never use are there on your system, taking up space and taking up resources. But if you build your own solution, you have the ability to only build in the features you actually need and will actually use, and therefore you can make the overall tool, software, whatever, you can make it a lot smaller and possibly even faster because it takes up a lot less footprint and a lot less resources. So kind of an example of this would be making your own like custom front end for Git to basically use as your remote code hosting system. And the other benefits to kind of rolling your own Git solution is if you have your own internal systems and security policies, if you kind of roll your own, you can kind of seamlessly integrate it into those. But because let's be honest with ourselves, how many of us, raise your hands, if you run your own Git server like GitLab, for instance, and basically only use it as a remote host for code with maybe an occasional pipeline or two, but you're essentially only scratching the surface of what GitLab can actually do. Raise your hands. I know mine, but both of mine are up because that is basically how I use GitLab. There are so many features in GitLab that I do not take advantage of, so technically speaking, there is a lot of wasted resources and quote-unquote bloat in there that I'm not using and taking advantage of, yet I still have to deal with it anyway. Whereas if I rolled my own front-end Git solution, I wouldn't have to worry about that. Now, granted, that's a lot of upfront costs, which we'll kind of get into later, but that is one of the pros of kind of making your own Custom solution is you can tailor it to have the exact features and needs and use cases that you actually need and use. So that kind of gets into the next one, which is if you roll your own solution, you have control over the features and the development timeline. Now, one of the potential drawbacks to going with a third party solution, whether that's an open source one or a proprietary one, is you have to rely on that vendor for things like, the new features that are coming, for, licensing things and all that good stuff. And if you want a new feature, it may come soon, it may not come soon. Depending on how big the project is, maybe you can submit a feature request and maybe it'll get added in the next update. Maybe it won't, but you basically have no control over that. So kind of an example here is if like you created your own like in-house ticketing system, you could, it could essentially be designed, without all the bloat that comes with Jira, which is kind of another one that people use to like track issues and stuff, and only focusing on like necessary workflows. And if you do realize that you need some kind of update to fit your in-house tooling, you can just, seamlessly make that update rather than having to rely on Atlassian in this case to make the update for you. And kind of in a similar vein is security and privacy considerations, because if you solely control the product, there's no external data storage or reliance on cloud, or closed source software or any kind of cloud services. If you build the product, whether it's open source or proprietary, depending on how paranoid you are, you might not trust anything that was written by anyone else. So if you build it yourself, you don't have to worry about someone else essentially siphoning your data, and you have complete and total control over everything that goes on, all of your input, all the data that goes in and out of your tool or platform. So kind of an example of, why you would want to do this is if you're a company handling sensitive intellectual property or customer data, or you're like a financial company and, you have some stock trading algorithm or something, I don't know. You wouldn't want that precious data falling into anyone's hands, so you might avoid a tool like Confluence or something and instead self-host or create your own custom documentation platform. But the other kind of thing when it comes to privacy and security considerations is if you do find, say, there's some kind of vulnerability in the software, you don't have to rely on waiting for a third party to patch the software. You can just do it yourself. Now, of course, that also comes with some drawbacks, as we'll get into in a little bit here when we talk about the downsides. But the last kind of pro, I guess I'll say, for rolling your own version is the potential cost savings, which may or may not actually be legitimate, but potential. So depending on what product you use, there are certain licenses or subscriptions or things like that that you have to pay on a recurring basis. But if you build it yourself, you don't have to worry about that, and the software is quote-unquote free. Now, I say it's free in quotes because, of course, it's not actually free, because the cost just comes from somewhere else. You're not explicitly paying to use the software, but who's developing the software? Software developers, and I would at least hope you are paying your software developers to develop and maintain this software. So while yes, you are not paying anyone else for the software, you are still paying your developers to develop the software. So it's kind of a trade-off there. So if kind of an example of this is if a startup wanted to avoid the hefty fees of using Atlassian products, they could essentially build their own lightweight internal alternatives. But getting into some of the downsides, we kind of touched a little bit on some of them during the pros section, but one of the most obvious ones is the time and the cost when it comes to building your own in-house tools. Because while everyone might want to roll their own solution for everything, it takes a lot of time to build your own solution for everything. So what might start out as like a simple tool can quickly become, a full-fledged product requiring ongoing maintenance, and you quickly realize that this tool that you wanted to, spin up real quick has now become basically a full-time thing rather than just, a simple tool that you worked on in your spare time. So, for instance, if you were building your own wiki system, eventually, you'll need versioning, access control, search functionality, and all that stuff. And you basically are reinventing the wheel when really all you wanted to do was host some files to keep track of like your documenting of your home lab, right? And now you have like this fully reinventing of the wheel when you could have used some other, wiki system. And then that kind of leads into the other point, which is the idea of a maintenance burden, or the long-term support, bug fixes, feature expansion. All of this stuff falls on you or falls on your team depending on, where you are. So while, yeah, it might have been, a nice side project, or if you're a company, it might have been, a quick internal tool to, help you, do something quicker, maybe automate something. The longer it kind of hangs around and the more people use it, people are inevitably going to find bugs. People are inevitably going to want more features. And then essentially you then kind of get into this loop of having to support the software, fix bugs, patch security vulnerabilities, add new features. And now your team has an entirely new project they have to support, which if it's an internal project, now you have to basically eat that cost because no one is paying you to do that. It just kind of comes from overhead, if you will. Um, so if you're a company, you essentially have to dedicate personnel to maintain that in-house software, where they otherwise could be supporting, customer-facing applications to, actually build the business and make money rather than maintaining the inner tools that you use. So kind of getting back to that, essentially homegrown Git front end, if you roll your own Git solution, yeah, it might work great, but when a new version of Git comes out with new features, you probably have to make some updates to your internal tooling to make sure all those new features are supported. Now, granted, I guess you could say, who needs those new features? We're not going to support them. But depending on how widespread this Git front end is that you're making, people might get mad at you that those features aren't supported. And we touched on this in the pros, but I'm touching on it again because it is also a con, and that is security. And the biggest one here is ensuring proper security practices, both in like things like authentication, encryption, and logging. All of those things require expertise, and if you mess up, you basically have a massive hole. So it, for instance, if you're trying to roll your own like authentication system for like, single sign-on type thing, if you mess that up, that is very, very bad. If you implement the encryption incorrectly, that could lead from, and a threat actor being easily able to break it to you essentially ransomwaring your entire network. So yeah, you got to be careful there. So if you roll your own solution, that is one of the downsides. But also, in terms of security, you're also on the hook for any vulnerabilities that might arise during development, which could be a positive and could be a negative depending on how you look at it. Because on the one hand, if you see a vulnerability, you don't have to wait for the vendor or the third party or whoever to patch that vulnerability and push an update to you. But on the other hand, you have to be the one to detect those vulnerabilities and patch them in the first place. Now, I guess depending on if you're an organization, like if you're a company or something and building your own tool, in theory, you would probably have some type of, security researchers or whatever, looking over your software to kind of check for things like this. But not everyone's perfect. They're not necessarily going to catch everything. The other thing is depending on how widespread the internal tool is, if you have some kind of insider threat thing going on, if there is a bug in your software that nobody has caught yet because everyone knows how to use the tool and no one tries to do other um, less intuitive things, like maybe putting in input that they probably shouldn't be putting in, and it causes some kind of a bug that no one else caught because they're using the tool legitimately. Well, now you have a bug and nobody, has caught it before, so you essentially have a nice good 0 day in there. So it's things like this that if you roll your own solution, you're basically on the hook for. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse, depending on how you look at it, because yes, you don't have to wait for someone else to patch the buggy or potential vulnerable software, but at the same time, you have to be the one to catch all of those bugs and vulnerabilities in the first place. So, kind of an example there is, like I said, if you kind of rolled your own identity management, it could introduce different vulnerabilities that weren't necessarily present in something like Okta. Um, so then comes the kind of the next con, which is feature parity with commercial solutions. Now, depending on what the purpose of your internal tool is, maybe you don't want feature parity with commercial solutions. But if you are, working for like a big enterprise or, whatever, if you're forcing all of your, employees to use internal tools, if they're not used to those tools and they're used to, say, some open source solution or some other proprietary solution, if your solution doesn't have a feature that the solution they're used to using has, they're probably not going to be very happy with you. Now, depending on what your internal tool is for, you might have been on the bleeding edge when you created the tool, and that might have been the entire reason why you rolled your own solution, because you did some research in the market and realized there was nothing that did what you wanted, so you rolled your own solution, which is a totally legitimate reason to roll your own solution. But after a while, you've been, updating your internal solution, and the market as a whole has kind of evolved and grown, and now your homegrown solution might start lagging behind some of the other more well-funded commercial tools, and now you kind of have a problem. So, for one kind of example is maybe you didn't like some of the features in Jira, for instance, so you decided to build your own version of Jira, and then it had the new features you wanted, but then Jira started making updates and basically included everything that you had in yours, but now it also has other features that your system doesn't have, and now you start lagging behind. So that kind of leads us into kind of the strengths of using an off-the-shelf solution rather than a in-house one. And I think probably the most obvious is you don't have to worry about building it from scratch. So you save a lot of time in the setup and kind of, implementation of the software, because you don't have to build it, plan it out, identify requirements, build it, test it, and iterate on it and all that good stuff. You basically download it, and maybe there's some setup involved, but you don't have to go through months or even years of development time. It's depending on who's setting it up for you. It could be either, an afternoon, it could maybe be a day or maybe a week or something like that, but still significantly less time than building your own solution. So one of the kind of obvious ones is we've been kind of touching on Git here, essentially using an off-the-shelf thing like GitLab or Git, which provides, a pretty robust Git UI rather than customizing and building your own front end for Git. And then kind of the next one we've touched on kind of ad nauseum at this point, I think, is the whole security issue. Because the one nice thing about going with a off-the-shelf solution is you don't have to worry about making your own security patches and compliance and updates and all that good stuff. All of those things, the updates, the patches, are handled by experts. And if you're getting your software from a reputable vendor, they probably have some sort of bug tracking thing that they're tracking these vulnerabilities, tracking these bugs, getting them patched, and pushing updates in a hopefully a relatively quick manner. So that would kind of be one of the benefits of going with, an off-the-shelf solution, like say maybe Confluence. You get all the benefits of all the compliance that gets built in, and making sure that all the bugs are patched, and there's no, if there are any vulnerabilities, they get patched and updates, and those get distributed to you in a timely fashion. And the other thing that I guess kind of goes a little unnoticed is kind of this idea of an ecosystem. Now, one nice thing about kind of building your own internal solutions is you can make everything very tight knit and integrated with one another. But there are also off the shelf solutions that kind of already plug into each other. A good solution to this is kind of the Atlassian suite. Everything's kind of all tied in and, bundled together. So if you use something like Jira, Confluence, and Bitbucket, everything kind of seamlessly integrates with one another. So you don't necessarily have to worry about doing all of that yourself, because that can be kind of an engineering challenge to get all of those tools syncing together. And then, of course, comes the cost factor, because yes, there might be an upfront cost to, procure the software or an ongoing license fee, but you're not having to pay development costs, which may or may not be unpredictable depending on what happens. Because, of course, if you're rolling your own solution, there's, of course, going to be a very steep and significant upfront cost to build out that solution. And then, depending on what kind of maintenance it needs going forward, that could potentially also be a kind of unknown cost, right? Because you might be budgeting for, oh yeah, we just need some support, making sure we're able to work with the latest operating systems and that kind of thing. But then, a month or two passes, and now you got feature updates that people are requesting and implementing. You got bug fixes going on, and there's a lot more than just making sure that the software still works after, say, a Linux update or a Windows update or a Mac OS update. So now, well, I guess before we move on, that is kind of one of the benefits of, going with an off-the-shelf solution, because you kind of know what the cost is going to be up front. Now, some solutions there is no cost, although some open source solutions will charge, for enterprise or business use. But regardless, whether it's, a set fee per user or it's just a blanket fee across the board, and you can easily budget and plan for that expense, rather than, developers' time to maintain your own in-house solution. And the next thing I wanted to kind of touch on is when, either rolling your own or going with an off-the-shelf one makes sense. Since we've kind of gone through some of the pros and cons, so if you have a very highly specialized use case, it might be worth, making your own solution. So if there is no commercial tool that fits your use case, or your team has very unique needs, this could be a good instance of where you might want to roll your own solution. Another one is kind of, as we touched on kind of earlier, is kind of privacy concerns. So if you are dealing with a lot of like highly confidential data, whether you're handling medical or financial information, or you're a government entity, for instance, you have a lot of data that you probably don't want going out into the ether and potentially leaking out into the interwebs. So making your own custom in-house solution where everything is going to be contained locally could be a good solution, and why you might want to roll your own. And then, depending on how big your company is, the licensing fees and scaling required with some of this commercial software could get out of hand pretty quickly. So because some companies, like, if for you to use their software, they charge sometimes by the user or by the request or things like that. So depending on how many requests or users you have, that cost might become to the point where it would be cheaper to essentially upfront the cost of building your own solution and paying developers to maintain it, rather than paying some other company with the exuberant, license fees that they require. So, how do you make the right decision? Now, of course, there is no one answer, and like everything in technology, it depends. But hopefully I can kind of give you some things that you should be looking for. So some of the questions you should be asking is there something that exists already that meets a large portion of what your use case and your needs are? Like maybe that's 80%, 90%, whatever that value is. Is there something that already mostly meets your needs? And the other thing you should be asking is, do you even have the development resources to maintain this thing long term? Because that's one thing that might often go underlooked is, yeah, you might have this great ambition to build up this tool from scratch, but if you don't have the resources to support that tool, support the maintenance, provide updates, fix bugs, patch vulnerabilities, things like that, if you don't have the resources to do that, it doesn't really make sense to roll your own solution if you can't even support it and, keep up with it. So, the other question you should also ask is this solution core to your business, or is it just for an internal tool? Like, are you planning on essentially making your own front end for Git and then just using it internally, or are you planning on releasing it to the public for others to use, whether that's through it being an open source project or maybe you charge for it? So those are some of the questions, because if it's just an internal tool, and there's essentially no way that this tool is going to make money from it, that is something you kind of have to think about is, can we, front this cost to develop this tool when we know we're not making anything from it and it's basically going to be overhead charges essentially? Do we have the funds coming in to be able to support, the development for this tool? Now, I think probably one of the more ideal solutions is kind of the hybrid approach, right? Where you take an open source project that already exists and then you kind of build on it rather than building something from scratch, starting from a good base and then building upon it. And the benefit to this too is, if you're being a good open source developer, you would then push those updates and changes back into the mainline so everyone can benefit, not just you. But I guess if you wanted to be a kind of a greedy little pig, you could, just kind of fork a project that kind of has mostly what you want and then just kind of make your own spin of it and, go about it that way, which is something that you could definitely do. But I think this last thing that I kind of want to touch on is something that is very important, which is, when should you abandon a homegrown solution? So if you build your own solution, it can be very hard to part with that solution, even if it is obviously not the best solution anymore. So, some things you want to be asking yourself on, is it time to part with your homegrown solution, is if the maintenance costs exceed the cost of migrating off to another tool. Like, is the cost you're accruing of developing, say your front end Git solution, is it worth, switching over to something like Git, GitLab, Bitbucket, or something like that, and having, kind of the training involved to get everyone up to speed on it, and kind of the additional time that it might take some developers to get used to using this new tool? Is that time worth, is it basically, does it save you money to, do that change rather than, continuing to put updates into this tool that you're developing? Another thing you also have to keep in mind is the technical debt of the project, because like every project, there is technical debt which slows down the development, and depending on what your timelines are, it could be getting to the point where any updates you want just take so dang long that you start falling behind, the off-the-shelf solutions, and your solution, even if it was at one point better, might not be anymore. And I guess it goes the other way too. It goes the other way too, because it's not specifically just for if you rolled your own solution. It even goes if you're using an off-the-shelf solution. For instance, if you're currently using GitLab, you shouldn't be using GitLab just because you've always been using GitLab and so you're just going to keep using it. What I mean by this is you should always be evaluating tools on the marketplace and evaluating, is the tool that I'm currently using actually the best tool for me, and should I keep using it? Now, if you're an enterprise, it's of course a little bit trickier because you're not just dealing with one person's opinion, you're dealing with a potentially large number of people's opinion. But of course, in a home lab situation, it's pretty easy. It's basically just you. And that is one of the nice things about a home lab, because if you do want to try something else out, you can easily just spin it up, test it for a bit, and then if you like it, great, keep using it. Otherwise, just go back to what you were using. But basically the thing is you don't want to kind of settle for, that age old question of, oh, why do we do it this way? Oh, well, that's just the way we've always done it, which that is not a good answer. So if that is your answer for why you are currently using a tool, whether it is an off-the-shelf tool or an in-house tool, if your answer is, well, that's the way we've always done it, or that's the tool we've always used, you might want to at least take a look at some of the other tools that exist out there. Even if you don't end up going with them, it's best to, kind of see what else is out there, see what features you may or may not have in your current solution, and then try to decide if it's actually worth migrating to. So, like I said, you should always be looking for other options, even if you currently have a solution that's on the market. There, in most spaces, there are multiple tools that do essentially the same job. So one thing we've been talking about frequently is a Git solution, like a front end for a Git repository. GitLab's one, Bitbucket's one, Git is one, GitHub is one. I mean, there's a lot of front end Git solutions. So just because you're currently using one doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best solution for you and best fits your needs and potentially budget too. But on the same time though, you might find that you're using an off-the-shelf solution and it's really not getting the job done for you, and you look around and none of the other off-the-shelf solutions would get the job done for you. So then you decide to go and roll your own, and that's okay too. So it definitely goes both ways, but so while I kind of started this with when should you abandon your homegrown solution, it also goes to just kind of a blanket statement of when should you abandon your current solution, whether it's an off-the-shelf one or a homegrown one. Essentially, you should be constantly evaluating what's on the market now, and determining is something else out there better for my use case or better for my budget than the tool that I'm currently using. So basically, kind of to summarize here, you kind of have to weigh the trade-offs, the pros and the cons, the cost versus the control, flexibility versus maintenance burden, ecosystem support if that's something that you care about. And like I said, I encourage all of you to evaluate your own projects, your home labs, and if you're working for a company, evaluate the tools that you work with on a day-to-day basis, and ask questions. If you work for a company and you're using a tool, ask why you use that tool, and is this really the best tool for the job? And while yes, change is hard, it's often what brings some of the most revolutionary inventions and ideas throughout the course of history. It's because people tried to challenge the status quo rather than just, accepting things for the way they are. Because, like I said, if your reason for doing something, your reason for doing something should never be, well, that's the way we've always done it. If that's your reason, you better find a better one. So yeah, that is kind of, some of the talking points I wanted to go over when talking about whether you should buy or should you build your own solution. But before we wrap up, let's get back to our trivia question for the week, which is the domain relentless.com redirects you to where? If you said apple.com, unfortunately, you are not correct. But if you said amazon.com, you are indeed correct. And one thing that I like about this trivia question is the fact that this isn't the only case where some otherwise randomly seeming domain redirects to, a different website, whether it's because that domain was the previous name of the company, or in like the case of Google's case, they basically have a bunch of the domains that are close to Google but are common misspellings of Google. So even if you misspell Google, it still takes you to Google. But then, of course, there's the other famous ones where, a company will buy not just the .com, but also the .net, .org, etc. for that same domain. So even if you type, say, I don't know if I didn't check this, but, google.net would still direct you to google.com, things like that. But one of the kind of the fun ones with Google is, like, if you spell Google with like only one O or three O's, it still directs you to Google. So it's kind of cool to see Easter eggs like that with domain names and things like that. So yeah, hopefully you got this week's trivia question correct, but I would think probably a lot of people didn't, because if we're being honest, before I looked up the answer, I would not have gotten it right. So if you didn't get it right, don't feel too bad. But that's going to do it for this episode. So if you enjoyed it, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And be sure to share this with friends and family members. Leave it a like, a rating, all that good stuff. And if you have any questions about this week's episode, or have any comments, topics, or ideas for future episodes, if you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below, or you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, and there's a link for that in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins Podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, full nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins Podcast.